good morning if you are in the West Coast, and good afternoon if you are in the East Coast, and good evening if you are joining us from across the ocean like our guest is today. Actually, both our speaker and our moderator are joining us from across the ocean, so it is good evening for them. I am very sorry for the technical trouble we had starting. I apologize for that. It is to do with my aim to keep unwanted visitors out, which requires authentication by Zoom, but that in turn creates troubles. I apologize. I think since we never had any unwanted visitors, I'm just going to get rid of that authentication by Zoom business. All right, I'm going to share my screen for a minute to introduce the panel. Here we go. And again, one more time, I apologize for this. Here we go. Today, we will be hearing about the recent work that got an OTSA prize last year, but not only an OTSA prize. The work that we will be hearing about also received the Best Dissertation Award from MESA. So it's a double award-winning work by Anna Sekulić. But before I introduce today's panel and leave it to our chair, let me tell you just 2 sentences, our upcoming programming. Next Friday, May 6th, this is May programming for What's Up. We will have Nomads and Climate, the Crisis of Pastoralism in Late Ottoman Kurdistan with Zozan Pehlivan, who received the Ömer Lütfü Barkan Article Prize last year. And then later this month, in our OTSA co-op series on Friday, May 13th. So it's like 3 Fridays in a row. This Friday, next Friday, the Friday after, we'll have Sabiha Sertel's Struggle for Modern Turkey. This is her autobiography translated into English. Sabiha Sertel's relatives, who were also the co-editors of the piece, who are Tia O'Brien and Nur Dirish, will be with us. So will be James Meyer and James Ryan, who taught the book in their classes. And Benjamin Fortner will be moderating. And then we will have a very special guest, Ezgi Başaran, a contemporary Turkish woman journalist who will reflect on her experiences of contemporary journalism in Turkey, looking back at Sabiha Sertel. Now, today, again, we are here on Archives, Empire and Community, Ottoman Paper in Catholic Spaces. I will introduce to you Molly Greene to introduce the panel. Molly Greene is not a stranger to any one of you, and she doesn't really need any introduction. She has been actually my professor at Princeton back in the day, and she also has been a professor of many Ottoman historians today. Her first book is A Shared World, Christians and Muslims in the Early Modern Mediterranean, that many of you read. Her second one was on Catholic pirates and Greek merchants, a maritime history of the Mediterranean, that I'm sure many of you also know and read. And then the more recent one is the Edinburgh History of the Greeks, 1453 to 1768, that I imagine a group among you would have seen and read already. It's been out for a few years now. And she is joining us from Athens. Molly, please, go ahead.
Hi, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
All right, good. Well, I'm very, very pleased to be included in this panel with my wonderful former student, I should say, Anna Sekulić. But let me first introduce the chair of the panel, Heather Ferguson, who received her PhD from University of California, Berkeley. And since then has been after a postdoc at Stanford, has been at Claremont McKenna since 2011 as Associate Professor of Ottoman and Middle Eastern History. Her 2018 book, The Proper Order of Things, Language, Power, and Law in Ottoman Administrative Discourses, engages with her interest in early modern empires, comparative early modern empires, categories of sovereignty and difference, linkages between archives and hegemonic constructions of power. We'll be hearing a lot about that today as well. And she is working, the recipient of numerous fellowships. She is now working on a new project called Sovereign Valedictions, Last Acts, and Archival Ventures in Ottoman and Habsburg Courts. So thank you, Heather, for serving as chair. And then Anna Sekulić received her PhD from Princeton in 2020 with the dissertation that you just heard about, and we'll hear about more in a minute. And she is now a postdoctoral, or the postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies at the University of Pittsburgh. And I'm very, very happy to be here to hear Anna talk about her work. So thank you.
So thank you so much, Molly, for this lovely introduction. It's really great to see you again here. Just before I start, Baki, did you make me the co-host so I can start sharing my PowerPoint?
One second, I had made you the co-host earlier, and
But then we stopped.
just did it again. All right, sorry.
Wonderful.
There you go. Okay.
Thank you. Let me just make sure that I do this thing right. Okay, can everyone hear and see? Perfect.
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. So again, thank you so much, Molly, for the introduction. And before I begin, I also want to thank Baki for inviting me and for giving me a chance today to share some of my work with the community here. And I also want to especially thank Heather Ferguson for agreeing to chair, to offer comments, and to really just talk to me and share the stage with me tonight. I'm going to start. I want to start us off really by talking broadly about the article on the archives. I happen to always forget what that title is, but I think it's like from the legal proof to something. You'll forgive me for like not knowing this exact like long title, but that article, and I'll speak about it in the context of larger phenomenon of archival practice in imperial peripheries that become a mechanism of community and authority building, and to show how local communities and local power structures, such as the Bosnian Franciscans, about which I talk and write for a while now, structures like them, how they use, repurpose, and sometimes subvert imperial institutions, technologies, and vocabularies for their own ends. So when I speak of archives, I essentially speak of institution that you can see here on the screen now, and it's the archive of the Monastery of the Holy Spirit in the town of Vojnica, which is situated in central Bosnia. And this church and monastery have essentially been on this very place that you can see here since early 16th century. That's actually not the beginning of the monastic institution in Bosnia. And in Vojnica, it actually goes earlier to the first half of the 15th century, but this kind of particular place and this kind of building and the structure here goes back to the 16th century, and it's been there ever since. In addition to a rich library and serving still as a monastery and a communal and religious center, right now it also houses the famous Ottoman archive. Right now having some around close to that is 3,000 pieces. So it's a really substantial and very important place also for Ottoman research. For me, it's a really important place, and you can see here just the way it kind of appears in a picture, kind of suspended between, you know, the town and the valley and the mountains, kind of heavens above. It really occupies that central and mediating space, and it's a really kind of good symbolic representation of the function that this place and this institution had in history, and kind of social and cultural fabric of the entire region. And for me, it's really been such a source of opportunity and inspiration and insight for as long as I've actually been doing this. Now, the monastery as an archive, and specifically as an Ottoman archive, has been also very interesting and important institution for historians since kind of the beginning of the Habsburg period, and that is the end of the Ottoman period, so around 1878. And from that time, onwards, different types of authors and different historians have been interested in publishing pieces of their archive. And you can see here, I just kind of gave you some of the snapshots of these different publications that came out at the turn of the century. And those efforts to kind of publish and kind of deal with the archive and present it to the larger public really culminated with this publication here, which is called Vojnička Regesta, or the Regesta of Vojnica, prepared in 1930s by the Croatian historian Josip Matasović, who kind of had an idea to essentially take the archive as a whole, and I'm talking about the Ottoman documents from that archive, and kind of translate it and made it available to the larger historical community. And it's that publication that until very recently, and I can talk about it in Q&A, about the more kind of recent efforts of the monastery and certain historians to kind of make the material available. But it was that publication here throughout the 20th century that was essentially the main source for the both Ottomanists and non-Ottomanists to kind of go and consult documents and consult material on the Ottoman period in Bosnia. And this is how it looked like. This is just kind of a random snapshot of the Regesta itself, and like how the kind of documents, the way they're listed in it, the different summaries look like. Now, for me, this is an important kind of giving you that background. It is an important aspect of the whole story of the archive, and it's and in the ways how this archival holding on Bosnian Franciscan monasteries have been discussed in the larger historiography and also in the kind of larger cultural discourses of the region. And in one of the papers that is forthcoming for me, I like in another paper, I discuss how the ways in which Matasović specifically presented the significance of this archive to the broader historical and intellectual community is essentially replicating a long existing Franciscan narrative about the precarious relationship with the Ottoman authorities and with the Ottoman institutions, and by extension with the Ottoman documents. So for this historian, as well as for many that followed, the sheer existence of the Ottoman documents in this monastic space was a sign of Ottoman oppression. These were the kind of testaments to all the times that the friars had to face the Ottoman authorities, like kind of indexing all these humiliations and extortions that they kind of experienced at the hands of the Ottoman authorities, as the story usually goes. So, in the 20th century, the Ottoman archives really became synonymous with Catholic suffering. Archives as a whole became one of the key elements of the Catholic cultural history and Franciscan self-narrative, which is the idea which I'm going to come back to at the end of my presentation today. But the publication itself, it does something else other than just kind of providing this larger framework of how we understand the archives. It also, as you can see here in front of you, it doesn't publish document translations or transcriptions in any way that we are kind of used to today, but it only offers, as you can see, really short summaries of these documents. Now we can ask how did Matasović come up with this, especially knowing that Matasović didn't know any Ottoman, and neither did anybody in the monastery where he was working and collecting from. So where did they come from? Some of them were prepared indeed by interpreters that were hired by the historian and by the monastery, and these people were at the time employed in the Habsburg interpreting service, so serving as translators, and some were actually the kind of learned people of Vojnica, so the kind of the Muslim neighbors who were obviously able to read Ottoman and kind of offer some of the translations that we can see on the they left their traces on some of these papers. But the majority of these summaries really come from the summaries of the documents that the friars themselves appended to the verso of the documents, and many of them are actually contemporary to the Ottoman text. So I'll just pause here and show you. Again, this is a random selection. If I just took 3 documents I think they're all dating from dating to the 16th century, and I kind of turned them, and I wanted to show you the verso pages and how these summaries and these different commentaries that we find on them look like. And you can see here these accruing layers of scripts, of meanings, and different comments and visions of like that the friars kind of added to it through centuries and kind of commenting on what is going on a document here. So you can see here it's a Cyrillic text. This is probably one of how the early commenting on these documents was. It's the 16th century. You would have a document that was preserved by kind of rolling it and then really kind of writing in a short summary or just a note of what they thought they were going to use the document for, and kind of, you know, write it here all the way on top. And this is yet another example. It has many more layers. This is the Cyrillic text going probably back to the 16th century. This is upside down. This is yet another kind of layer added to that, because I worked on it so much and I've been kind of immersing myself in these documents for years now, I can tell that this is going back to the 19th century. And then I can also recognize that the red ink and the way that things are kind of highlighted in this text is probably going to the mid-19th century, when there were the attempts to compose an index to kind of like make sense of some of these documents for different kind of purposes that they needed. Then I can talk about it. I write about it in the paper, but I can talk about it more in the Q&A. And these are yet other kind of attempts at kind of marking the documents and stuff. So, and here also you have Cyrillic text, and then you have this text. I also learned to recognize that this is probably coming from the interpreter in the 20th century, because I can kind of tell the hand and ink and the kind of the way that the years are marked here. So all of this is to say that this is the kind of the situation of what you're kind of finding on the back, on the verso of these documents. And what we got then with the kind of the preparation of the publication that was kind of to serve to the historiographical community, we get this. So the kind of the big question is how we go, what kind of choices and what kind of strategies are employed in having this translated into kind of these neat summaries that, you know, the generations of historians now have essentially been using. And it kind of really made its way into the historiography of the region and of the Franciscan order, Catholic community as we know it now. So essentially then what this means is that one of the main sources and windows into the Ottoman documents featured essentially Franciscan reactions and visions of what the friars understood these documents were saying. So that I guess that wasn't really giving us what we now understand as a source, the Ottoman text, but it really gave us what Franciscans wanted these documents to be and represent. And that varied with age and with the situation and with the type of document. And so it's this clash between not only between the source book in the kind of comments on the documents, but the clash between these different sides of a paper, of the Ottoman text and of everything that was added by the Franciscans or by the monastery subsequently. That's really the kind of the clash and the rifts and the possibilities that come from that is what drew me to this topic and what really inspired me to look for other types of stories in the archives, and how archive then as a concept in space and practice can be historicized. So then the paper came, and so that's really the kind of how the paper came into being and what my motivation was. And in writing the paper, I try to tell a slice of a longer historical developments of the monastic community by tracing a single document, and that's the document in question, which the whole paper is based. So tracing it from the time of its production in the 16th century and through different phases of its deployment, attempts at translation, at hiding and putting it away, indexing it and referencing it as a source in a book in the 20th century. So really kind of this longue durée walking in the footsteps of this piece of paper. In exploring then the Ottoman text, the different interventions and inscriptions then added by friars over the centuries, in exploring then the rifts in meaning and intention, so these two sides of the paper, as well as in exploring and reading these inscriptions against the backdrop of other stories and events that took place both locally and imperially, I suggest that different ways of interpreting and using documents can be read as a source in themselves. The clashes between the narratives and ideas emanating from different sides of the document in this archive produce stories and histories in their own right. And kind of, when I think of how what kind of ways I can really kind of convey this idea of a kind of a clash of narratives that come out of that, like one of the metaphors or that really kind of, I came up with, it's kind of like rooted in geology and thinking of kind of these tectonic movements of having kind of different parts of the crust, of the Earth's crust kind of clashing, but clash that is not necessarily like, it doesn't really annihilate anything, but it kind of exposes things that we haven't seen before, and it kind of produces new terrains. And so in kind of like exploring then those rifts and exploring the things that don't really match, I think it produces new narratives and it exposes histories that we wouldn't see otherwise. Now the document specifically in question, this one here, I'm not going to go into any detail, but I just want to kind of tell a couple of words about the text itself and like what it means. Is a 16th century hujat dating to 1569, I think, early, and it's produced by the Qadi of Sarajevo, and it's testifying. It's essentially a transaction document or documenting a transaction, and says that friars and the Catholic community of Vojnica, so the friars and their neighbors, are essentially together buying a series of property in the vicinity of monasteries. So it's essentially showing us like a land transaction. They're buying land together. The document is valuable also just as an Ottoman text. It's actually a really important one because it points out that Selim II's confiscation of monasteries, which is most commonly associated with the confiscation of larger Orthodox monastic estates, was actually not only limited to the Orthodox community, but it had kind of reverberations in the Catholic spaces as well, and it threatened in different ways of much smaller Catholic holdings in Bosnia. But the kind of things, that the way these two communities handled the confiscation and how it played out is a bit different. So I can, if anybody's interested, I'm happy to talk about it also during Q&A. Now, because the hujat testifies to the Franciscan communal common ownership of the land in question, it's then interesting how in the subsequent centuries, the document became one of the principal pieces of evidence about the exclusive Franciscan ownership of land. So the friars marked this document and used it as a proof of ownership. And then that's how they essentially use it until the end of the 19th century, even though the kind of the primary, the first, so to speak, I don't want to say original Ottoman text here really tells a bit, it tells a different story. The Catholic community, which the hujat named as co-owners of the property, became kind of erased from the archival record, and it also became erased from the monastic memory of rights in communal property ownership. So the dynamic of using the documents, both deploying them as evidence in court and by building the communal, cultural, and economic capital based on the very fact of their possession, suggests the importance of the archives, not only for what they explicitly say, but in the symbolic power of those who hold them and are able to project it. So as I say in one place in the paper, the archive for the Franciscans presented an opportunity, an ongoing opportunity to translate these Ottoman writings and translate Ottoman official vocabularies and principles and kind of these legal codes into useful narratives for their own ends, for their own kind of building, for their own building and attempts to build authority within their community. Now, in this specific case, this end or the ability to wield the symbolic power kind of comes to a halt or ends or shifts or changes with the 19th century. At some point, both the Ottoman courts and definitely later the Habsburg regime starts paying new attention to the actual meaning and the text of the document, which is when the Franciscan claims that they had built on them come under the renewed scrutiny and also kind of land them in trouble. The stories told by the friars and those told by the documents don't really align anymore. And for a while, then the tactic that the friars deployed in kind of, again, preserving their property and solidifying their kind of communal leadership, the tactic they employ becomes kind of hiding the document or kind of putting it away. An act that I think wasn't just one of kind of negating or kind of sidetracking the document, but it's the hiding or the storing or not showing it in a way becomes kind of a productive archival practice or strategy. And here you can see a big kind of inscription saying like kind of don't show it, don't show it in the light of day, something like that. But that wasn't the end of kind of using or putting this document to use. It was resurrected again, but not in a court anymore, but in a book. And it was where it again appears is an early 20th century monograph. It's a kind of a history of the monastery, still the only one existing, and really kind of still a classic in its own way. And it's here that a document is listed in a way that is now more familiar to us in this kind of scientific historical manner as a proof and a footnote that kind of supports the claims that the monastery had always, from the kind of time of the 16th century, been owner of the land in question, which is actually a big chunk of land in Twentieth. And this brings me then to the kind of historiographical background that I mentioned earlier, the one where the existence of the archive and the accumulation of documents is already a source. It produces a discourse. The Ottoman archival legacy became a cultural asset for the Franciscans, an asset that made sense in the new cultural context and new political context of Bosnia, in which one didn't have to prove ownership in court anymore, but it became really important to prove the kind of longevity and to prove that an institution like Franciscans had a long history. And so the archive now was performing a different kind of service and doing different kind of work for this community. So following the trajectory of a single document then allowed me to examine multiple interconnected stories and possibilities that it spurred over the course of several centuries. It also allowed me to highlight how the life of a document is long and unpredictable, and how determining what a document means or says is actually a much more complicated undertaking than just reading it. Materiality practices and symbolic currencies all play a really important role. And I think when there is a possibility to do so, it's really, it pays off in kind of digging deeper into and trying to read out multiple layers of archives and what kind of accumulation of documents as such the stories it tells. It's not always possible, but in a place like Twentieth, one is really fortunate to have that foundation that one can really dig deep into. And I want to kind of wrap up by just kind of going back to the idea of the community. And here is one of my favorite pictures. I think this is like 1900s community of the Catholics in front of the church in Kreševo, and Kreševo is yet another of those older monasteries in the vicinity of Twentieth. And kind of talk about the communities and ways in which the Franciscan order and their monastic network built authority among the Catholic subjects, and really left these indelible trails, not only that traces that last to this very day. There are obviously so many elements to that story of what made the community and what sustained it, but archive and the access and preservation and the ability to control and handle the Ottoman paper is certainly one of the more important elements in that story. The monasteries use their ability to store paper and their accruing experience and skill to deploy them. They often use those very archives to dispossess their own community members and thus tie them even more closely to the monastic fold. So it's this kind of paradox that the archive allows for. But not only was it the kind of handling, the skillful handling of the Ottoman documents, also things coming from the Ottoman chancery that allowed friars to kind of, build their communal foundations, but they also, in certain cases, emulated some of those very chancery practices. I don't speak about that in the paper that is available now, but in a forthcoming paper. But I just want to mention here that in some of the monastery, what we have traces that the Franciscans adopted the use of defters for tracing their own revenues as well as for controlling their own community members. So we have the idea of defters as the Ottoman administrative tool, and how it came to play an important role in a particular Catholic as well as social and moral context. So essentially what I think all of this has been about then is that I think about a lot of this kind of archive that I had a privilege to go in and kind of to really explore all of its spaces and lacunae and stories and materialities that are kind of built into them, and kind of by digging deep into stories that are not always visible just on a kind of on the surface of a page, really allowed me to see the what I think is the really underlying dynamic of what Catholic community is and what it represented both in Ottoman and post-Ottoman time. And this is this kind of interplay of emulation of the Ottoman imperial practices and kind of subversion of them at the same time. This kind of borrowings and subversion of different technologies, different vocabularies, different methods of controlling revenues and land and people that are really kind of built the kind of modus operandi of what that community was, and that really shows in kind of interesting material way also in the way this archive looks like, the way it's kind of written and the way it's stored, and it's really kind of not just like kind of mass of paper, but an interesting metaphor and kind of incarnation of what that community really was all about, and really showing that although nowadays we kind of like to see the Catholics in Bosnia both as Ottomanists who are not kind of readily thinking of them as kind of part of the Ottoman history, but also the community themselves that are not always liking to see themselves as part of that kind of an Ottoman context and kind of look west to the kind of Catholic and Western models, but it really shows that there is so much of the kind of classic Ottoman foundations that are built into what that community really is all about. And I'm going to stop here, and thanks so much, and I look forward to your questions.
Okay, I think I'm up. So I will try to be brief, but I'm not sure I'm going to be that good at it, because even as Anna was talking, I was taking more notes, but I'll keep track of the time, especially because we had a slightly late start today. But I want to, of course, start by saying that it's such an honor to engage with the scholar that links together what I think are some of the most important historiographic arcs in the broader field of Ottoman studies. And more importantly, moves outside some of the isolationist models of regional studies to engage with environmental, legal, comparative early modern empires, and of course, the resurgent focus on the study of archivistics, or the archive as an object of inquiry in and of itself. I'm actually doing my talk by setting aside for a moment the wonderful exegesis of the article that Anna just gave us, and dive back a little bit into the broader scope of her dissertation, and then use that to read back into the article itself. So to refer back to like a scholar who explores all these historiographic arcs, I mean, I think many of us aim to achieve these rather impressive goals, such as linking different methodologies and modes of inquiry, bridging regional and global histories, tackling situated linguistic registers, and generating a narrative arc that demonstrates how difference is intertwined into a collective imperial economy. But I have to say that Anna's research should remind us of how this can truly properly be done. So kudos and well-deserved prizes on both fronts. So to set aside, like I said, the topic of archives, community, and Ottoman paper reality for just a moment, I want to talk a little bit about broader research questions as represented in the dissertation, and use that to think about the future of Ottoman studies as typified in the article as well. And first, I think I should pause for a moment and say, as many of you know, we have lost a resounding voice in the field with the passing of Rifat Bey Abu al-Hajj, Rifat Bey or Rifat Abu al-Hajj. And whether explicitly or implicitly, I think we have all been profoundly impacted by his work. And I bring him up here because in long email exchanges with him in the past few years and 1 2-hour at least phone conversation, I listened to him outline all of the things we were doing wrong right now in the field. For those of you who knew him better than I, the gist of that conversation, like what we're doing wrong, should come as no surprise. But one of the things he kept returning to was the abandonment of religion as a focus of inquiry, and more importantly, this embrace of commensuration without analytically engaging with difference as both a historical phenomenon and a methodology. Now, while at least in our conversations, he did not touch much on material culture or the environment, I kept thinking of my discussions with him when I reread Anna's work for our time together today. So let me explain why. So first, by identifying both material and metaphorical engagements with the landscape, again, referencing the dissertation, Anna moves out of the more typical approaches to religion, i.e. the establishment of a learned hierarchy, tensions between heterodox and orthodox religious practices and legal authority, or the negotiation of communal privileges. And she argues that by tracking varied engagements with the natural landscape, we can also make manifest cultural, legal, ideological, and spiritual imaginaries that are otherwise obscured. Which leads me to a second point. What exactly in our historical method obscures some of the imaginaries that Anna reveals in her dissertation and the article and broader research trajectory? First, by privileging the imperial archive, and here the critique is not that imperial legibility or the methods by which the Ottoman establishment sought to render diverse landscapes, social groupings, political rivalries, first legible within its own vocabulary of governance and then actionable as a method of rule. So it's not that this dynamic is not also key to her research and arguments, but rather that she has found a way to destabilize the primacy of this Ottoman imperial vision via the natural landscape and the Slavic monastic archives. With the natural landscape in the dissertation as mediator, we can see contestations and negotiations enacted in surprising ways, surprising in the sense that they simply were not visible for those of us trapped in the imperial archive. So third point, being trapped or captivated by the imperial archive. It is now a kind of siren call that state-centric narratives reinforce a narrative of Ottoman imperial history, which is shaped by the anxieties and concerns revealed in those records deemed worthy of preservation by the Ottoman bureaucratic establishment. Many have turned to the sigil as a means to move toward regional, cultural, and social histories, and toward questions that illuminate hierarchies of power in terms of gender, race, and status. But before us today, however, we have an example of an alternative path, one that does not simply offer a regional case study via the alternative archival ethos and impetus of a monastery, but an alternative path that offers the landscape as a site of cultural, communal, political, and textual production. In other words, we have moved via Anna's work beyond those divides we see referenced over and over in publications, my own included. So beyond the divide of center periphery, local imperial, religious political, and towards something that feels a bit more like an evolving conversation with space, place, and situated textual and material embodiments that become the scaffolding of a new vision into the path. Okay, so fourth point. I know I'm going too long already, but just bear with me for a moment. So her dissertation is not a traditional environmental history, and I promise this leads us back into the article as well. So I remember my classes with a linguistic anthropologist, William Hanks, back in those good old days of grad school in Berkeley. And he used to say that language is about belief and belief is spatialized. So I have to admit, it took me quite a while and a lot of rereading of Lefebvre to even come close to thinking I might have an inkling of what he meant by that phrase. But when I read Anna's dissertation, I really had an aha moment because she moves from underground terrains to mountaintops, from bounded urban spaces configured in a tug of war between monastic and imperial authorities, between the spiritual conceptions of heavenly gardens to the redefinition of wilderness through forestry and pasturage, all culminating in a final chapter that I definitely identify as my favorite, in a wonderful dissertation as a whole, the many trees of Osman, in which she uses arboreal categories as a means to re-engage with the mechanisms by which religious boundaries were both marked and sustained. So all of that is meant to say, this is definitely not a traditional environmental history. And I want to pivot into the article here to rethread the 4 points I've outlined already and open us up into a broader conversation with a couple of key questions. There is the obvious in the article, which is nonetheless a critical intervention in both the field of Ottoman studies and the broader resurgent obsession with the history of the archive. So the obvious element of this article is that Anna unfixes record-keeping practices from the dictates of the Ottoman establishment and of the storehouse of records that we now consult in the present. She traces the horizon or life story of a document and argues that the circulation of a document across landscapes and in and out of different sites of preservation and invocation reveals the methods by which documents came to hold their own kind of mediatory power. So think back to how she used the natural landscape in the dissertation for mediation. And that these documents contain histories of their own, histories that, if uncovered, reveal that their materiality and their discursive power are themselves far from fixed, but rather structures of meaning that change based on the situated localities and the power brokers that identify, preserve, and invoke a document. The article also tracks back through all the previous points I've highlighted, moving beyond state-centric approaches framed by state-generated documents, research that actually attempts to counter that by reading against the grain of Defter or deploying sigil. So moreover, once again, she steps outside the voluminous counter archive of Orthodox Christian communities to track the textual practices of a Franciscan monastery and reveals the afterlife of a document by, as you've been listening to, tracking one hujjah and invoking Anne Stoller's argument for thinking of a document as a sociology of a copy. I'll return to that in a moment. So she shifts from a key event to how that event was indexed to a sophisticated approach to paleography that transforms the materiality of the text into a register of cultural and political claims before finally engaging with how scholars would invoke the document in 19th and 20th centuries, who then engage in their own acts of silencing and erasure. So this leads me to a series of questions that I hope will kind of open us out into a broader conversation with those who are present today. And I'm sure many of you have your own questions. And of course, Anna gave you some hints as to things that she could cover again herself if people are interested. So first, I want to point to some language and attendant to language analytic assumptions related to it, specifically related to how we, as scholars, engage with what we mean by document, archive, copy, and original. So when these words are deployed by us in articles or other scholarly publications, what do we mean by them, and how do we kind of address some of the moments in which Anna herself was concerned about the kind of analytic slippage that happens when we use terms that suggest fixity. So Anna has shown that a document itself is not fixed. It has both a meaning horizon and a landscape that it traverses that is both natural and geographic and also textual, in that it's invoked and deployed and redeployed in different inscriptions and historical moments. So this gives us the potential of moving beyond the kind of copy and original to thinking, as she addressed today, the contest between sides, the verso of a text that possesses its own historical itinerary. So those who study record-keeping practices are really engaged with developing alternative language to copy and original in order to track the kind of life cycle that Anna has displayed for us today. And I want to point out, if you caught it in the presentation this morning, that when Anna was referencing the document at the core of the article, she explicitly said, I don't want to call the Ottoman text the original. So that's just a marker for us of a scholar who's attentive to the valences of these terms and being careful and precise about how we use them in order to avoid making assumptions about what a document is or can do, or where an archive exists and is deployed. So that leads me to the next point. So the definition of the archive itself. How do we assess institutional repositories as a fixed site, while also being attentive to how specific textual artifacts circulate and traverse geographies? So think back to the picture of the archive in Monastery that she had up on the screen this morning, and making the comment, the archive as suspended and as a mediator between different power brokers who assert authority via text. I thought that visual is an excellent example of how we might engage productively with what we mean by archive. And that leads us finally to spatial definitions, how we can use this model that Anna has defined for us today in this article and in her broader kind of research trajectory as a way of rethinking imperial geographies. So approaches to boundary marking between different authorities, but also definitions of internal and external of different sides of a paper, all illustrating contestations over status and the authority to make certain kind of claims. And as a final reflection, Anna leads us to think about precarity, the precarious status of a Franciscan monastery in relation to Ottoman authorities, but also the precarity of the textual landscape dependent on contingency and accident and varying investments in the significance and potential valence of a particular document across time and space. Assessing precarity and fragility can reconfigure an obsession with narratives of centralization and, of course, all the other binaries that populate the field. And along with precarity, references the obscurantism that occurs in the present day archive as indexes and digitized collections impose their own summaries that flatten the landscape and the horizon of the text that we as scholars have to work against. So again, kind of bridging between the dissertation and the article, Anna kind of asked or invites us to pay attention to layers and the accruing of layers, the commentaries that can allow us to come full circle to kind of where I started off in my comments, with the dissertation offering an alternative approach to environmental history by being attentive to the layers accruing in the materiality of texts themselves. And then the article fully illuminates that process by tracing the kind of horizon of a particular document. And then, of course, to add a question generated from my personal interests, Anna mentioned just towards the end of her presentation, the emulation of chancery practices and the mirroring of tactics that are visible in the horizons of texts. And just a kind of note that this is also an underexplored layer of the life cycle or sociology of a document. I'm going to stop here, but there's also one other thing that she mentioned, if you caught the phrase, that it's not always possible to do this work, to trace the full kind of horizon or life cycle of a particular document. So just to kind of ask us as a group, what can we do as scholars if the sociology of a text and its redeployment across chronologies and geographies cannot be fully traced? And how do we fill in the stories and track the erasures and absences without participating in our own acts of silencing as well? So thank you again, Anna. It was a delight.
Thank you. Thank you both. I mean, Heather, I think you raised the bar for discussants. People in the future will be, oh, do you expect us to do as much work as Heather did? Thank you. Thank you so much, Heather. Anna, thank you so much. Would you like to say a few things about Heather's comments, a few things that she mentioned, or should we go to questions? Would you like to take a few moments to respond?
I just want to, I don't think I can properly respond to what she just did, which is an extremely generous, kind of rehashing, it seems like everything I've ever written. So, thank you so much for really engaging with all this work that, still actually, even as you were kind of so systematically and nicely going through all the layers, and layers, and really kind of, I think at the kind of heart of it, I just kind of wow, there's so much for me to wrap my head around it. So I don't know if I can, I don't know where to what to stab and what to begin with, but So I just want to thank you, and I hope we can kind of continue that conversation. But I think I'd like to open the floor to kind of like get other people chances to speak. But there's so much here that, and even just like kind of bringing the dissertation and which is the environmental history kind of, as you mentioned in that article, that I've been long struggling on how to really kind of connect together. But I knew at the same time that they're coming from kind of that same source, that same ideas of this kind of layered lives and layered, you know, kind of modes of existing, layers, the layered ways of thinking about rule and layered ways of belonging, all of it somehow together. So I think I'll just like let other people ask questions before I just kind of say something silly here. But thank you so much, really.
Great. Everyone, please feel free to raise your hand if you would like to, you know, turn on your video and ask your question in person, or also feel free, if you're, you know, a little shy to turn on your video, to just write a question on chat, and we'll make sure that it be read aloud. It's for the video recording before Anna responds. And there is already a hand raised. I'm going to let Eleni Gara, my colleague from the Aegean, go first. And then Molly, would you like to be charging of Q&A, or Heather? I don't have to do this. Either one of you could. Let's start with Eleni, though. Eleni, go ahead.
Hello to everybody. Thank you very much to both of you, Anna and Heather. It was very, very interesting, and I'm looking forward to reading Anna's work, which I have not. And so, excuse the question, but it actually has to do with, I mean, it's related to my basic ignorance here. You have this very interesting document that you're tracing, whose story you're tracing throughout the centuries. And so I would like to ask, what does it exactly say? I mean, if I understand correctly, the transaction, there is the registering of transaction between whom? So who are the parties involved? You mentioned at some point that the community is also buying. How does this, is this specified in the document? By which terms? So I would like to know exactly what the Ottoman documents say, if possible, and then to understand, because sorry, I have not read the article, what is the difference then in the short commentary, in the contemporary, at least, comment, so that, and then what else beyond what you have already told us, that this note do not show to anybody else and so on, appear. So what are the basic difference here, as in the specifically stated on the document in the Ottoman and in the Bosnian text? That would be basically my question, because I mean, from similar cases from Greek monastic archives, these usually the short commentaries on the back of the verso are short references like titles, short titles, so that people who did not know Ottoman could understand, the people of the monastery, the monks themselves, would know which document is about what. And often these short notes, in a sense, translate or actually reformulate the content of the Ottoman document in legal terms and legal categories that are familiar to monks from the Byzantine, from the Roman law. So I'm thinking whether what you, I was wondering whether what you have here is something of that sort. I mean, the difference between the Ottoman and the contemporary Bosnian text, or there is something else, and how these commentary or that you find in this document or in other documents could be similar to or different from commentaries of that type that we regularly find in monastic archives throughout the Ottoman lands. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for this question. Yeah, like, so I'm going to just like very briefly tell you what the document is about. Like, you really, the article is online, so like, you know, like you can go back to it. But so the whole thing is that it's a good question about like, so who is selling what? And actually the thing is that here, it's not a kind of a classic transaction as like person A came to court and sell it to person B, but it's the one that the monastery already has been confiscated. So we have essentially the kind of agents that came to Bosnia and like kind of acting on selling the second Sferman, asking for tapus on the existing property. So this property was probably monasteries before, or at least they were kind of using it in some way. And they didn't have a tapu, so the document confiscated it, and that's kind of what the first part of the thing says. And like I was able to kind of figure that out thanks to all the work that Eugenia Kermely has done and that Alexander Fotis has done, because there's a really kind of, you can see that this is the same context. So then the monasteries, the land is confiscated, and then the friars buy it on, I'm blanking the word, when like more people bid for it. What's the word?
Auction.
Yes, on auction. They buy it on auction. They're actually like buying against another Muslim guy who is trying to buy it. So they kind of gang up together with the different representatives of the Catholic community, and they buy it together. And that's what the whole thing is. But then they're using this document later on in different court cases in the end of the 16th century, in the 17th century, and in the 18th century to kind of fight other people who were coming and claiming that property for themselves. I mean, there's no way I can kind of summarize it for you right now, because it's story.
Sorry.
They're facing assaults on that and kind of that property constantly. So they're kind of using that thing to essentially kind of create a like longer and longer paper trail of you know, to say that this is their own property. Although the document really kind of makes it clear that it's not only theirs, it also belongs to the community as well. So that's kind of how the kind of whole story evolves, and it really kind of, it ebbs and flows all the way to the 19th century. The kind of the story, the repercussions of it, like somehow funnily constantly repeat themselves. And then you see the document reference in other documents as well. So it kind of like, it really is the kind of an interesting case, so you can kind of follow it.
The term for the community?
Sorry?
The term, what is the term that they use for the community?
I mean, do you want me to?
You said that the community buys. So what does it say?
It names the people, and I think it says Varoš. I don't think it says Varoš. I don't know. I need to look at it, I think. So
it's that the basic, the people from the Varoš. So yeah. Baki and Eleni and Anna and Molly and Heather and so on. Echali, Varoshi, whatever, Foinica. Okay, no, okay, it doesn't matter. I just wanted to understand how.
Yeah, it says the friars better and the Christians. This is how I translate it. I need to look at the transcription. Yeah. And as for your other question about the, like, what the kind of summaries say, those are, it will say sometimes we'll actually go into like a larger story, kind of retelling what the document was about. And sometimes it will just be like, for the, I don't know, field, or for the forest, or document about carrying guns because they get these privileges to carry a gun or to be on a horse and stuff. So, but what is interesting there is that kind of if you have one document as such, it's like kind of doesn't, yeah, like it is something about a horse, right? But when you kind of really immerse yourself in this entire archive, and when you kind of read a lot of those, you start to see that they are kind of constantly emphasizing certain things of the documents against other things, silencing other things. Like sometimes the documents or the privileges they're given are not clear cut. Sometimes they're forbidden certain things and they don't mention that. So they're really kind of creating a record on the back of that paper that other friars can, as you mentioned, can indeed go to and know what this is about. And that's how the community is constantly, the community of friars, I mean here, because they're the ones kind of handling these documents, that's their go-to archive. That's the kind of the information that they're learning, and that's kind of the kind of, I think, the sense of their privileges and or their possessions that they're getting. Although as you know, like every descent into the Ottoman text, it makes it for a much more complicated picture. So, for example, with the document here in question, they only mention that, oh, this is that we possess all those lands. That's kind of the commentary that is like in the beginning, that's appended there in the Cyrillic. But when you read a document, I mean, this is actually a pretty, I don't want to say dangerous story, or it was like a tense situation they were faced. They were almost, their fields were almost taken away because they were kind of like facing this kind of danger from this like Selim II's Fermans and stuff, and that kind of gets erased, and what gets remembered and what gets used is like, oh yeah, we've always had that field. And that's how when they come to the 19th century and the Habsburg authorities want to kind of take that away from them, they're like, really kind of adamant, no, we've always had that, look at this paper. Because their kind of consciousness and stuff of ownership and the narratives and of legitimacy really comes from that kind of this accruing layers that they themselves have added onto the documents, if that makes sense.
I'll go ahead and ask a question, as maybe that might encourage a few people to consider some questions too.
Sorry to interrupt, Baki. Sorry, I realized that you had asked if I wanted to handle the Q&A. I don't want to do that just because I'm just looking at my phone and it's very small. So normally I would, but
don't worry about it. Don't worry about it at all. Don't worry about it at all, Molly. No problem.
Okay.
Anna, I thought of several questions, but I don't want to take too much time. One thing that might perhaps be of interest to open it up to further discussion could be, this goes back to the moment of this event, this confiscation. You mentioned during your presentation that this was not just happening to this particular place at this time, it was also happening to Greek Orthodox properties at this time during the reign of Selim II. It's not something I had heard about. It's my ignorance. I'm sort of wondering, is there any sort of larger picture of this? Why did they do this at this point? Is it because they're trying to grasp some property because they need money? Why did they decide to target so much church property, and this poor community now has to rebuy what they already owned in the past in order to keep their existence? It looks like a tragic moment. So do you know something about the larger picture?
I mean, I really am not an expert on that. I think, as I said, like I really learned everything I know about it from Evgenia Kermelit's work. It's like done fantastic work on that. I don't know if we know why the government decided to do that. Like, I think scholars like Sekulić, if I'm not mistaken, have, or like people have been kind of thinking that perhaps Selim II did it to finance the campaigns. Others, don't they say that this was done together with Abu Sud in order to kind of like address the what now became the kind of the illegal holdings of Waqfs, because the way that the Christians were holding Waqfs was not really in line with how the kind of the Islam, the real Waqf, so to speak, was meant to be, because it has to be like, you know, dedicated to pious purposes, but Christians were kind of just using it in order to keep property together. So there's been, I think, different ideas as to why that happened, but it definitely hit the Orthodox community much more. And for one of the reasons is because they just had some much bigger holdings, many of them going back to the Byzantine time, and the Catholics, the Franciscan, they just weren't in that position, so there wasn't even much to take from them. And I know this about Voinitsa, and that was my argument, that I see that this is how the kind of whole thing reverberated in Voinitsa, and they just kind of bought the tapu again, which is what many other Orthodox monasteries did. That was the thing, that they were going to confiscate them, but then Ebu Suud kind of declared that they are going to be the one to be offered first to buy it back, so to kind of like essentially take money from them. And I don't know whether that happened actually in other Catholic monasteries in Bosnia, because they just don't have such an archive, and I don't know whether that kind of thing reverberated elsewhere or not.
Could I say something here?
Yes, go ahead, Molly, of course.
Yeah, it's interesting, Baki. It just shows the divisions even within, you know, the field of Ottoman studies, because if you work on Christians, this is an essential part of the narrative, and it's extremely well known. I mean, this is any sort of narrative of Christian history, at least in the Balkans. This doesn't seem to have happened in the Arab lands, and I don't think anybody knows why that is. But the confiscation of the monasteries is a you know, it's a landmark. It's a well-known landmark in any sort of narrative of Christian history, and the two explanations that Anna gave are exactly that, kind of a moment of contingency. The war for Cyprus had just concluded or was about to conclude. They needed money, or part of this you know, gradual Islamization of landholding in the empire. But it's yeah, it's interesting how within our field, certain people, you know, people know different narratives, but this is a big one for anyone who does Christian history. And Anna, I'm quite sure, you can correct me, I mean, Anna is the first one to look at this with the Catholic monastery. It's never been, you know, I mean, that's not an essential part of her dissertation, but that's it's only been looked at in terms of Orthodox monasteries.
And that actually is a great lead in to Emra's question, where he posed like what generated your initial interest in exploring the Franciscan monastery. So what led you to that?
Sure. Well, what led me was kind of stumbling upon that collection of sources. I think I was in a grad seminar and I had to like write something, and I was kind of digging around and I realized, oh, there's that entire Ottoman archive in a monastery. And I knew nothing about Franciscans before that. So I wonder whether I want to say that it was just kind of like, it was a bit random, perhaps. I wanted to do something into religious histories for sure. And I think that just gave me a segue. And then I was lucky to actually have access to it back in 2015, and spent a year in Bosnia kind of researching and being allowed to actually photocopy and get all the sources with me. And I've been kind of digging through them ever since. And it was really kind of the combination of, okay, some of my underlying interests and what I was interested in doing in Ottoman studies, being in that space, and really kind of digging deep into that archives and the kind of discovering stories that came out of that.
And we'll move on to Guy.
Hi, Anna. See you again. And this is a conversation that we've had for years now, and I'm now going to ask you as a Franciscan studies person. And one of the things that is interesting is how much of it actually appears and informs the way that Franciscans elsewhere. And I'm reminded of the annals of the Franciscans in Jerusalem that I've looked at, and how this knowledge then becomes part of the Franciscan network in the empire and the Middle East. And specifically, I'm curious if you see this production of sort of these manuals of how you keep a records when you deal with when you run a monastery in the empire, and these things may be in Rome or elsewhere. So I'm curious if, I mean, what do you think about the impact of this story to record keeping across the empire?
Yeah, that's thank you for this, Guy. I mean, this is a really tough question. I have to say I haven't done much research beyond Bosnia, beyond that community in Bosnia, but it's a question that I kind of get a lot about record keeping, and whether that experience gets translated into, you know, into a book, into a manuscript, into some sort of a reference and stuff. And I've never seen that. It's just something that comes with kind of doing it and being exposed to that community, being exposed to that space. And I haven't seen examples of that kind of knowledge in that particular form traveling across the borders. If anything, it's kind of the opposite, if I can say so, because they were so, obviously they were so connected with the Catholic world, but they were also very inward looking in some ways as well, because they kind of built their own position and their privileges within the Catholic world by kind of claiming that exclusive knowledge of knowing how to handle the Ottomans. And not something that they would share. You see the references over and over again. Oh yeah, like don't send a bishop, don't send a Jesuit here, don't send anybody from Hungary or whatever, because like we are the only ones that really know how to handle the Ottomans. We are like kind of battling this paper and this harassment all day long, and nobody else knows how to do it. So if anything, they were again kind of thinking of the kind of archive and this kind of practice and the idea of like Ottomans and papers and authorities, of how this kind of became not only something you do or you write about, but something you talk about and build certain claims upon. So if anything, I would say that kind of guarding this, or kind of keeping it perhaps purposely arcane, was part of the kind of game for them, if that makes any sense.
I'm going to move to Randy, but just a moment before I do that, Anna, there's been a few citations that have been recorded in chat. So I know you're kind of fielding questions and you have a lot going on, but yeah, I just want to make sure you don't lose track of that. And then to also note that this seems like a really good opportunity to do a plug for JOTSA and a new section that is going to kind of work through dissertations being published, not just not just give a kind of citation of them, but to also use it as an opportunity to kind of think about recent research in the field that might otherwise be ignored, since one dissertation was just referenced in the chat. So now, sorry, Randy, go ahead.
Thank you very much, and hi to all the people that I know and who are here. I would just like to bring up some information about a young researcher whose name, I put it in the chat, whose name is Vanessa de Obaldia. And she recently, maybe 3-4 years ago now, 2018, I think it was, defended a very interesting dissertation here in Aix-Marseille University about the very similar to the topic on which you're studying, Anna and Eleni and other people. She used the Ottoman court documents to study questions about Christian Waqf in Istanbul, more or less between the 16th, 17th, 18th, and she went into the 19th century using the paper trail of the mobilization by the Franciscan friars and by other Christian orders as well, to try to prove, even sometimes it was a bit ambivalent, to try to prove their ownership of buildings, which may have been or may not have been in Waqf, although some of them have been, but as well as cemeteries, properties, green areas, different areas behind churches and monasteries. And it's very interesting because what she found and her argument was very similar to what you have just presented here. I don't know if you're aware of her work. She hasn't published her dissertation yet. She's working on it. Her last name is de Obaldia. I put it in the chat. Yeah, but she's published a couple of articles on this question. She lives in Istanbul right now. And so it might be interesting to look at some of her work. And I'm going to send her a message about your work in case she's not aware of it.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah,
And she also, I just wanted to say, and it's a question also for you, besides using the Ottoman court documents, she also, she went and she worked in the propaganda archives of the Vatican, and she found quite a bit of documentation in the Vatican archives. She found information in Venice, in Genoa, some other, in the French archives too, and to try to have a number of different approaches to study the question which were used, the question of ownership rights and the narrative, which was created by these Franciscan friars and others with respect to the ownership of property. I was wondering if you also had the opportunity to sort of cross archives in this sense. Thank you.
Thank you so much for bringing up Vanessa's work, and I definitely want to get in touch with her and check out her other work. In terms of the other archives, yes, I've done some work in the Propaganda Fide, but the thing is, the difference is that the kind of the property and the kind of questions I kind of extrapolate from all these sources and stuff are a bit different. I can imagine, I mean, I don't know her work, but I can imagine the kind of like, you know, talking about property and friars in Istanbul is very different than talking about a very local context. They're both kind of important, but they have very different ramifications, and not same things and same preoccupations would like show up in this kind of larger global archives. So yeah, that's what I would have to say on this. But I did have an opportunity to go beyond Bosnia.
Yeah, even though I just want to say one more thing. Even though she was working on the on this question in Istanbul, in fact, I don't think the argumentation is really and the situation is not really all that different, because I mean, I was her supervisor for her dissertation, and I saw the way that she worked in the archives, the way that she studied these questions, and it's very, very similar, in fact, to the circumstances that you've studied there. And so, yes, of course, it's the empire's capital, but it's still very, very localized, and all the connections with Eastern Europe and all the connections with France as well, I mean, and other parts of the Franciscan, let's say, community are very present. So
Yeah, for sure.
yeah, there's many similarities.
Thank you so much for bringing this up.
Baki?
We are kind of approaching the end of our time, but I had a question that I cannot put aside. It's something related to my own interest. You know, what are sort of cultural identity markers? At some point, I was interested in how the Ottomans defined the Franks as the people who wore hats and pants, and in sort of thinking about where, you know, the Ottoman realms start and where the realm of the Franks start. The Catholic identity, I am not familiar with at all. Ottoman Catholic identity. From the image that you shared, you said it's from early 20th century. I had seen, you know, representations of Greek Orthodox, Armenian Orthodox in manuscripts, and it struck me that none of Ottoman Christians seem to have been wearing hats the way Franks do. They all had headgear that was kind of in the realm, in the larger realm of turban-like. And in that image, they seem to be wearing fezzes, I guess 19th century, early 19th century. So then would it be right to say that Ottoman realm Catholics also had not quite Frank-like hats, but more like turban family belonging headgear? I'm asking this to see where these boundaries lie in terms of, you know, Eastern European versus Western European, because one tends to think Eastern Roman, Western Roman Empire, and Croatia perhaps is in the West, but then these Catholics looked very Eastern Ottoman to me on the image that you shared. Is that a unique image, or is that, do you have any sense of like how they carried themselves, what kind of clothing they wore? Did they feel more belonging to Western Frankish Europe or more to sort of Ottoman realm?
Thank you, Vaki, for that. That's a really actually kind of a multi-layered question, and it's really it depends, I think, with what time period we're talking about. And I don't know much about the clothing. I hope to kind of actually find out more. What we saw in the picture, I think they look like a very Ottoman company. They're all wearing fez. This is 1900. There's a lot of actually pictures that I've seen with women wearing shalwar, and I think they start wearing shalwar at some point in the early 19th century, because some of the friars were writing against that, saying that this is what is this kind of like attempt to like kind of, you know, adopt a Muslim fashion and stuff. So there's a, you know, I don't know exactly how and when and things change, but like there is like, I think, and then we've seen that, I think, across empire, a tendency for at least certain classes of the community to adopt this kind of more Ottoman, or like, you know, this more kind of elite ways of dressing. There is also a lot of ethnographic literature also from the exactly the same period, turn of the 20th century. You have a lot of these kind of Habsburg observers coming in and like kind of like, you know, writing about the communities in Bosnia, and they always kind of like religiously segregate them, and they always kind of say that the Catholics were wearing special types of clothing, especially women. And I don't know exactly the details, but it will be they're going to wear something white, or like how they're going to like tie their hair, you know, where they're wearing crosses. The women were also kind of, and that's a whole other thing, but like famous and examined for tattooing crosses onto their hands and chests. So I think there is definitely an attempt to emulate the Ottomans, and that they are part of that, but there's also kind of the distinctions. But I think the distinctions that develop within the community and how they differentiate themselves against the Muslims and the Orthodox, because that's who they're essentially sharing spaces, is not necessarily by kind of looking beyond the Ottoman Empire to the west, or like looking west and east. I think this kind of, you know, this kind of differences become kind of figured out locally. Like some of these are, I don't want to use the word indigenous, I don't like it, but they're kind of local and rooted in the regional practices, in the regional kind of material culture and things, not just always something like, oh, am I going to wear a hat like a French, I'm going to be like an Ottoman Pasha or something. So yeah, that's what I would have to say on that. And the friars, though, the friars themselves have, if you read reports, you know, from 17th century onwards, people will always say that they just look like this Ottoman base. And sometimes they're also accused that they're kind of like putting all the silk among themselves to like look like a pasha or something. And then in the first half of the 20th century, people remember them as this like kind of Ottoman gentlemen, and they say how they were kind of carry their hair like that. They would like have this huge mustache also to look like an Ottoman. So there were a lot of references that they are kind of really looking very, what they said, Turkish, right? But there are and things are kind of constantly changing. In the 19th century, then when the Habsburgs come, there are again like there are kind of new models being introduced. So yeah, it is a kind of there are a lot of layers to that, but that's how I would answer the question.
Thank you so much. We are beyond our and a half mark, and I don't see any new hands or any new chat things either. It's the right time to end it, and I really thank you, Anna, for sharing your work with us, Heather, for that above and beyond history on the pieces. Thank you so much. I'm sure it's going to help Anna a lot, as she, I imagine, is thinking about how to turn her dissertation into a book. Thank you. And thank you so much for people who asked questions. This is exactly the reason why we are doing these things to connect people, and I think Randy's sort of comment about the new work dissertation is going to help. I think Anna, Randy, I think you had another intervention in one of the meetings earlier that connected some work about Waqf. So I'm so glad you're joining these meetings and you know, helping people connect. Thank you so much. And please, everybody, remember what Heather said. We are hoping to add a section to JOTSA for newly finished dissertations. So, you know, in the future, maybe we could remember to let JOTSA know about a newly done dissertation. So we would put an English summary, and then that way local works done everywhere could also circulate in English language, widely read journals, and it would help the dissemination. Thank you all. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And if you make time next week, we are here again on Friday. Take good care.
Thank you so much, everyone. Baki, Heather, Molly, and all the participants. And thank you for questions.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.